Well, welcome everybody once again to the briefing room, and a special welcome to everybody in the US who's watching, because a third of the people who watch come from the US. So much appreciated. Thank you very much. And today we are jumping into the jungle. We are going tanks, mud, and guts galore. And we're talking to historian and teacher Jack Bowsher. I was just looking at the title, not your name, mate. Thunder Run and Meiktila. Is that
Meiktila,
right?
yeah. Well, I
Meiktila.
mean, you hear it lots of different ways.
Meiktila, 1945. This can I before I say what I liked about the book, can I say that the build of this book is awesome? It's a really solid built book, really good thick paper for the pages. I love stuff like that. I love how
So you're
books are.
making it sound like an ASMR
Yeah,
experience.
it's a really well built book. It's just brilliant, and
Yeah,
yeah,
thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me as well.
yeah,
Great to
you're
be on the briefing room.
very welcome. And yeah, it's a great read. It's a really good read, and
Yeah, thank you. That's really kind.
and it's exciting, and as I always say about these books, horrifying as well. But
Mm.
yeah, it's a great read. So I'll put a link down below so everybody can go grab a copy.
Yeah, of course.
First
Thank
of
you.
You're welcome. First of all, what made you think I really want to write about this?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that converge at one point, and some of them are pretty apt. So I was doing a military history masters in 2021, 2022. So sort of that idea came out of COVID, sort of sitting at home doing not a lot.
Hmm.
And basically, we were studying the 2003 Thunder Run to Baghdad. So the American
Hmm.
drive to Baghdad. A really amazing operation in and of itself. That's why we were studying it. But it just so happened I was doing the readings and the literature review for my dissertation, which became my first book, which was a more general history of the Burma Campaign
Hmm.
about tanks, so forgotten armor. Uh, so I was reading about this operation there, but at quite a small scale, very focused only on the armor operation side of it. And I made that link between the fact that it was a thunder run, because no one at the time called what happened in 1945 a thunder run. I've sort of put that backwards on it retrospectively. But we were doing the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and then Putin invaded Ukraine. And the thing that sort of joined up there was he tried to do what is basically a thunder run, but he did it badly. So he sent a column of vehicles south from Belarus directly towards Kiev.
Yeah.
But he got his logistics wrong. He got the sort of the theory behind it wrong. It wasn't really a maneuverist. It was just a straight line, whereas the Thunder Run travels on a straight line, but it uses maneuver in a much more clever way. In 2003, there's the significance of air power. Putin doesn't use air power in the same way, and for different complicated reasons. But the main point is that there was kind of like this triumvirate of what did the Americans do right in 2003, what did the Russians get wrong in 2022, and what did Slim get right in 1945, and the fact that they all overlapped with each other and they're all doing things, and you can see where lessons are learned, and that sort of thing. And that's really what got me into it. This is an idea for then the next book.
Set the scene for us at the beginning of the book. Where are we? Who are we with?
Yes, yeah. So I start the book really immediately after the Battle of Imphal and Kohima, which people have. Those are probably the two main battles that people have heard of
Mhm.
when they're following the Burma campaign, if they're even thinking about it at all, because obviously that's a big part of it. It's the
Yeah,
forgotten war,
exactly.
that sort of thing. So the Battle of Imphal and Kohima is the Japanese attempt to invade India. It fails. Wonderful story there, but it is not the story of this book.
Mhm.
I begin with really the breakout from that attempted invasion. So the Japanese are still in India, but they're exhausted. They've taken tens of thousands, about 30,000 dead, 23,000 wounded that have all been got out. So it's a huge failure for the Japanese. Effectively a corps has been mauled.
Mhm.
And the British break out of the Imphal plain, and they have to get through the sort of these two different mountainous river valleys to get to the only nearby realistic crossing point of the Chindwin. Now, the Chindwin River is the sort of the last natural barrier. It's not the literal legal. Well, I suppose it is literal. It's not the legal border, but really it's the actual border, because
Mhm.
it's the big geographical feature that separates Burma and India in that corner, alongside the hills of the river valley that it's part of. And the Chindwin's a major river. It's about 1,400 yards across. So it is a big barrier. It's 3 times wider than the Rhine, for example, where the crossing takes place in Germany in 1945, which is a sort of key point. And this is your classic small unit operations in the jungle by the 11th East African Division. Very, very another one of these forgotten divisions. They're all sort of Ugandans, Kenyans, Tanganyikans, and other countries as well, with white British officers. And they're doing that classic jungle fighting that we all think about. The Chindits do this kind of fighting, that sort of thing. But a big part of the thesis of this book and the previous book is the fact that the big thing that happens in the Burma campaign is both sides are constantly trying to find opportunities to get out of jungle, to then have much bigger battles. The Japanese trying to get, when they invade India, they're trying to get to the supply hub at Dimapur, get to the Brahmaputra River, and hope for a big political uprising. But that will involve them getting out of the jungles and the mountains. Slim in 1945 is deliberately trying to get onto the central dry belt just over the Chindwin River, to try and then have a big army battle and finally destroy the Japanese in that central dry belt. Because the interesting thing is most of this battle takes place really on what is practically desert. And he's trying to use his armoured mobility, his air power, and all those sorts of things, because the Japanese don't really have a good counter. A big lesson of 1942, 3, and 4 is the Japanese are not very good at countering armoured warfare. And this is the big thing that's really forgotten from the narrative. Everything becomes built around how can we supply and sustain mechanized forces across 4,000-foot mountain ranges and the Chindwin River, and eventually the Irrawaddy River, which is the very large river that's a couple of miles across, that literally divides Burma in half in an almost diagonal line. It's all about really how can we, because all the training that takes place to make 14th Army into this really good jungle force is very quickly just readapted into mobile warfare, which they had been doing before they turned into a jungle force. And so really it's just the middle bit of the war where they're like this, and they change at the moment when they need to break out in 1945. So that's really where the book starts. It's that breakout from Imphal, going down these 2 river valleys and crossing the Chindwin. And sort of an interesting bit there is the fact that the Chindwin is bridged by a Bailey Bridge, which is 1,400 yards, 1,300 and something yards wide. To get over this river, and it's the largest Bailey Bridge that's ever been built at the time. Although it does get, the Canadians do build a bigger one over the Rhine later. But a big difference I always make is the Chindwin Bailey Bridge is 600 miles from Dimapur, 700 miles from Dimapur, something like that, and it's 2 4,000-foot mountain ranges. It's 400 miles, 2 4,000-foot mountain ranges. It is a much more difficult prospect building that Bailey Bridge than it is, the one that's built at Rees by the Canadians. That's 100 miles from Antwerp, and it's a European road network, and it's flat. It's the North German and the Dutch plains. It's a very much easier prospect.
And who are the people that you begin this story with, and why do we see what's happening through their eyes? Why have you chosen those people?
So, I mean, I have a podcast called the Forgotten War Podcast with Robert Lyman, and we kind of play well with each other, if you see what I mean, because he is a very, very sort of high level strategic historian, and I'm very interested in what's going on sort of like at the ground level. And that's really what my books kind of reflect. And I obviously do weave in the strategic level things, but I'm not about the sort of the wide ranging, all the different meetings and strategy and all those sorts of things. Yeah. I'm interested in those things, but I'm generally, those are the bits where I'm engineering the next set piece thing, because I want to try to give people, I mean, a big part of it is I want to read books like this. And so I write them because no one else is writing them on the Burma campaign. What I try to do is choose someone who is representative of that particular moment. So, for example, when we're breaking out the Imphal Plain, I would have loved to have found, say, African voices, but they're just not recorded. They come from an oral history tradition. And so it's really, really hard to find those things from the distance of Britain. The fact that I'm a new historian, I'm only a couple of years into this as a career, I'm not receiving the kind of advances that means that the next book is going to be able to pay for me to spend, a month in, say, Africa trying to interview people in Ghana, for example. I'm not capable of doing that, and they're just not available otherwise. And even then, I might not find anything of value. That's the other thing. So there's almost an element I can't afford to take that risk of spending that money. But I do my best as I can. So, like for example, this one, the intelligence officer John Nunnally, I follow him. So obviously he's a white British voice, but that's the reality of the the colonial period, is that a lot of this stuff is written down by the white colonial powers. But he is a wonderful witness, and he talks about a lot of things. I have to triangulate him a bit. His book is not entirely honest, with a couple of little things. I won't spoil it for the reader, but I cover the tension at the heart of his sort of testimony. I don't shy away from the fact that he's not been honest, but it's a very important part of his story, I think. But I also follow people like, coming down a parallel valley, there's a tank driver, Malcolm Connolly, and I'm very lucky. I know his grandson, actually. And his sort of efforts to get a tank, one of only 8 tanks in this particular advance, going hundreds of miles down the Tiddim Road, parallel to the East Africans in another valley. But they both converge on a single individual place. And again, it's all just about finding who is the best person to represent this side of that story. So an officer in an African unit, a tank driver. In other places, it's, foot soldiers, and some of them are memoirs. Some of them it's come from, one of the best things is, brigade war diaries, a battalion level war diary, which is the lowest down you can get. It's real pot luck whether you're actually going to get anything decent from an eyewitness written shortly afterwards. Sometimes it'll just say they were on so-and-so place at so-and-so time, and that's about it. Whereas other times you'll get a very, very detailed hour by hour description of what happens. And the Indian Army generally are really, really good at this. But the real golden records are often in the brigade level diaries, because they have after action reports written by a named officer who was there, rather than a nameless adjutant, where if you can't find out the name of that guy, you don't know who the witness is in the war diary at the battalion level. But if you go up to brigade, you often get these things. And so sometimes it's those, and all the audio recordings of the Imperial War Museum, letters. One of my favorite people that I follow in the book is a guy who's writing to his mum and his sister a few times, a guy called Charles Braitley, who's on the airfield at Meiktila, for example. He's there. And it's just one of those very visceral things. And he admits to his sister he's worried he was too descriptive to his mother, and then was worrying about the fact he might have upset her with his last letter. Just those nice little moving moments when, you don't think of soldiers like this, because, we're conditioned by stuff like Band of Brothers, where it's very focused on the action. But there are these things, the letters home don't necessarily focus on those things, but they do bring up the hardship. I'm very lucky. I found a lot of really amazing sources for this, which in some battles is really difficult to find.
I like the touching parts of it, though. It gives it a more human feel. And Field Marshal Slim, of course, there's a lot written about him. There's several books that I've read that mention him. So you've got a good source there too. What I liked about the book was the real anticipation before Thunder Run begins. And how do you think the men were feeling at that particular time? Do you think it was nerves, fear? Do you think they had hope?
Yeah. So, there's a classic historian's answer to this, in that it depends who you are and what you're about to do. So, when they cross the Irrawaddy rivers, because a big thing, perhaps I'll do a bit of the strategy thing here, before I get into that question, is once they cross the Chindu and they've built that Bailey Bridge, what Slim assumes is going to happen is the Japanese will fight tooth and nail for every inch, because that's what they've just done on the far side of the Chinduin. That's what they were doing in 1943. 1942, the Japanese are on the attack. It's a little bit different. He's very, very used to this idea. And of course, the Japanese reputation in the entire war by the end of 1944 is they fight to the death, banzai charges, all these sorts of things. And the thing is, we do have to slightly remember is that isn't entirely true, because there are plenty of examples throughout the war where the Japanese do withdraw if it's the operationally most coherent thing to do, if it's basically doctrinally acceptable. Now, they will fight bitter, they will retreat later, and all these sorts of things, generally to their detriment, because it means that they have greater wastage than they could have done if they'd pulled back earlier. But the basic point here, Slim assumes they're therefore going to fight the moment they get across the Chinduin in that plain, with the Irrawaddy behind them. And I think he's completely wrong. The new Japanese commander, who's replaced the guy that was at Imphal and Kohima because it's gone wrong, a guy called Hotaru Kimura, he's had an education in Europe in the interwar period. He spent time with the Weimar army. He spent time in Nazi Germany as well. He spent time in London. He's done all these sorts of different things. And he's got a sort of slightly different view to a lot of his colleagues who have fought in, say, China or have maybe fought in the Pacific, although most of the ones that go to the Pacific stay in the Pacific, etc. He basically withdraws behind the Irrawaddy because, well, why wouldn't you withdraw behind a river that is a mile wide in the most important area? And also, why would you stay in the central dry belt where it's not very good defensible territory? Like, you can dig in and things like that, but it's big open spaces. It's, like I said, it's practically a desert. And the Allies are using, air power being radioed in on cab rank. Any of you that know what's happening in Western Europe from 1944, they're calling in cab rank air support and so on, maneuverist tank warfare and so on. The Allies are completely capable of that. So why would Kimras offer up his army for destruction? It doesn't make sense. So he pulls back behind the Irrawaddy. Slim has made an assumption that hasn't come off. Okay? And he says that, Defeat into Victory is one of those books where he's very, he's self-deprecating. He doesn't ever act like, say, how Monty would, that he's this all-seeing, all-knowing being. Whereas Slim is more of a case of, I got that wrong. He admits his mistakes, for example, in a way that Monty tends not to. Like he's, the Arnhem is 90% successful, all that sort of thing. Well, 90% isn't successful, is it? Like, anyway, so that's really where we get to this the crossing of the Irrawaddy, and then that. So your original question is all about, what's the sense of the soldiers? And I gave that historian's answer. It depends who you are. So if you're in the 17th Indian Division, who are the unit that has been earmarked for the Thunder Run as the infantry component, there is a mixture amongst the soldiers of, there is an element of, we're back in action now after fighting at Imphal. They've had they've had a few months out. They've rested, refitted. The refitting is important because they take on vehicles. They're literally begging and borrowing, units that are resting are handing over their vehicles and that sort of thing. Whether that's universal carriers, lorries is a big one because, they've completely cut down on all of that because they've been fighting sort of jungle methods for the previous year. So they have to completely reinvent themselves. But the thing is, there is nothing like an army with its tails up. And in fact, as you've mentioned it, I've just remembered there's a really good quote that actually shows this that I'll quickly find. Sorry, mate, if you want to edit me out for this bit. No. But it's one of those bits where I put in a few dividers between the pages, between parts, and I put a little quote that sort of shows the thing. So this is by a guy called Harold Mitchell. Now, he's not in 17th Indian Division, but I think it gives the idea of the soldiers that are moving back up to the front. So he says, at Manipur Railhead, men of a dozen different nationalities rubbed shoulders, where men of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, Canada and America, who spoke with the same tongue with many accents, mixed freely with Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims, Gurkhas, Chinese and East and West Africans. The spirit of victory prevailed, the quiet confidence of an army on its way to win a war. And I think there's a lot of that. The 17th Indian Division have had a really hard fight with the Japanese at Imphal. Okay, Imphal is a close run thing. I mean, admittedly, it's Kohima that is the closer run thing, and 17th Indian Division aren't there, but they are both bitter battles that go on for months. In particular, Imphal, actually, because that's the longer of the two battles as well. So they've had this very bitter fight. They had a very difficult fight at the beginning of the battle. They're nearly encircled and they have to break out through the Japanese encirclement. And the other thing is, you go further back. At the beginning of the war, the 17th Indian Division are the first division into action at the beginning when the Japanese invade. They take the brunt of the initial Japanese invasion. There's one guy that I follow in Thunder Run who, my next book is a 1942 book. He's in a battalion called the 7th and 10th Belush Regiment, John Randall. Amazing guy, ends up as like a brigadier or major general or something in the post-war British Army. He's a wonderful, wonderful witness because he's very forensic in his Imperial War Museum audio recordings. He kept a diary and then he wrote things up and all that sort of thing. John Randall is there on the January 1942 when his regiment takes about 80% casualties. And pulls out, and he fights this fighting retreat all the way back. They reinvent themselves in 1943 into a jungle unit. He then goes back into Imphal. They fight the Battle of Imphal. They then reinvent themselves for the Thunder Run and Meiktila and so on, and then they go on to do that in mechanized warfare. He does the entire war start to finish. An amazing, amazing witness. Real gold dust kind of witness. And he talks about the fact that in the 17th Indian Division, their tails are definitely up. They are winning. Okay, and that's really what Harold Mitchell, the witness that I just read out, they are both, nothing breeds good morale than winning and advancing. When you're pulling back, that's depressing. You've just dug a big hole that you've got to sit yourself in. You're told you're going to fight there and hold the enemy off. And then an hour later or 2 hours or a day later, you're told, actually, no, we've got to move back. That's the lot of many soldiers. There'll probably be listeners that have fought before that know exactly what that feels like, how annoying that must be. So he has this thing where he understands that they are ready for this fight. They're up for this fight. But also the fact is that at the end of the day, the Japanese are not an easy ride. They're doing very, very well, but they are going to be really challenged again, because that's just what the Japanese are like. And the interesting thing is, right at the end of the war, just before Rangoon, and again, I won't spoil it too much, but like he really sees his men finally get into a bit of a bloodlust with the Japanese at one point. He finds it actually quite scary. His men had never been like that, and he's been through 3 years. And there's this particular moment at the end where his men actually are almost scary in a particular assault that they take part in. So they're well motivated. But then you've got other ones, things like you've got people like the infantry units that maybe are a bit less used to victory than them. People who've had tougher fights. They are more apprehensive. So there are a couple of people that I talk about who, a really good one, for example, is David Punch Cowan, who's the general in charge of 17th Indian Division. The Third Arakan campaign that starts in December 1944, goes all the way through to the end of the war in 1945. One of the big objectives for that is to capture islands like Akyab Island, Ramri Island, so that, because this is sort of in line with the southern part of Burma, the coast obviously comes all the way down the whole length of Burma. But if you capture these islands, you can send supply flights west to east at roughly the same distance. Whereas, supply flights coming from, say, Imphal, the further south they advance, the longer those supply flights have to get. So capturing the coastal islands or the bits just inland where you can build airfields, that will make air supply possible, and also bombing possible, both tactical and strategic bombing and so on places like Rangoon. So this is the other thing that happens. They start bombing, or saying that really they've started tactical bombing in 1943 with the arrival of the first liberators, because they've got the range. But they can do a lot more tactical bombing from these islands, as well as the supply flights. And a brilliant book I recommend if people want it is Lucy Bettridge Dyson's Jungle Commandos. You want to reach out to her because it's a wonderful book. But obviously that covers that side of it, and it's quite a good complement to Thunder Run, because those are the operations that are, I tangentially mention them, but they are actually crucial, because without them you can't have the Thunder Run, because you wouldn't have the ability to supply Meiktila by air, because it's coming from that coastal region instead, especially once the battle gets underway, because the crucial battles there are sort of January, February, so they're ready for this that happens at the beginning of March. A quick thing I will say, because she will talk about it as well in more detail, but the Ramri Island crocodiles are a complete myth. Okay, it didn't happen. There might be the odd person that maybe was chewed up by like an alligator or crocodile, just one of them, okay, or whatever. But 1,000 Japanese dying because of crocodiles, it's just zoologically not possible, because zoologists have weighed in on this. There are papers, academic papers by zoologists saying it literally, like, that island is not big enough, wouldn't have enough prey when it isn't like being used in military operations with soldiers all over it. It wouldn't have had a population big enough to stomach a meal that size across a colony. There wouldn't be that many. There just wouldn't be physically enough in a place that small with so little prey. Before the war. And also, lastly, the fact is it's slightly disrespectful to people like the 8th Lincolns, who are the ones that actually go into that swamp and actually kill and chase the Japanese out. And also the Royal Navy patrol boats, who shoot up a lot of the evacuating soldiers in the water. As the Japanese are making makeshift rafts and country boats to try and cross over back to the mainland, it's the Royal Navy that does a lot of the killing. The crocodiles are basically irrelevant. It's a complete myth that needs to be got rid of. But, the main point of these operations, including Ramri, is basically to supply the central dry belt and be a hopping point to get to Rangoon amphibiously, especially if they run out, because the sort of the elephant in the room, to use a Far East Asian idea, is the fact that air power cannot run at anywhere near the same intensity in the monsoon. And so the other thing about Thunder Run is it has this ticking clock. You have to defeat the Japanese in the central dry belt, win at both Mandalay and Meiktila, and then get the 400 miles to Rangoon before, middle of May, if you're lucky. And so there's this constant time pressure in the background that gets more and more intense the longer the fighting goes on. Because, to be honest, the fight at Meiktila probably lasts about a week longer than they hoped, but they get away with it. It is the main thing. They do get to Rangoon before that, just as the monsoon is starting.
And I will be talking to Lucy about Jungle Commandos.
Yeah, perfect.
So I'll ask her about the crocodiles.
Yeah, do. She's like me. She'll get really into telling people how much of a myth it is. Whatever the comment section might say below, it is definitely a myth.
And you did mention, which was a great lead-in, about respecting the Indian involvement, in World War II as a whole.
Mm.
How did the Indian and the British units bridge the culture gap to work as a single unit?
So, one of the biggest things is the fact that, when a British unit sees an Indian unit fighting, they realise that they're actually very, very professional. Mm. And this is a classic sort of thing about the Indian Army that's often forgotten, is the fact that, not the fact they're volunteers. Everyone knows they're volunteers. 2.5 million volunteers in the Second World War, largest volunteer army that's ever existed. What people often don't think about is the fact that they may come from poor rural backgrounds and they have to be made literate. Mm. But those Indian soldiers, there's a guy called John Prendergast, who I follow in the first book. He talks about the fact that, like a lot of British soldiers, when it's clocking off time, in barracks and stuff, they're going and playing a bit of football, or they're going into the town if they've got a pass to go and get drunk and all that sort of thing, whatever. That they don't talk shop, that sort of thing. Their free time is their free time. Indian soldiers, he says, you frequently see them, and he was a machine gunner. He said one of the things that you get is when a new missive is brought out, or the training manual, the new recruits sit there and they read their training manuals book to book, and they're trying to memorize. He says they're doing this thing, they'll read something and then they'll be lean back, close their eyes, and they'll pursue almost sort of silently mouthing things. And he just says the Indian soldier is incredibly professional. They want to be really good at soldiering. And that comes through with all the stuff like you go back to the sort of the way that the British have said, like, oh, you're martial races, you're special, so you should join the army, Punjabi Muslim, Sikhs, etc., the Gurkhas, obviously. And there's elements of, sort of like, the colonial project, a little bit of sort of a presumptive racism that it's like, you're going to be soldiers because you're really good at soldiering. It's part of your DNA and all, leaning into almost like eugenics type stuff as well. But the main point is really it just breeds an esprit de corps that a lot of Indian soldiers have to be really, really good. And the thing is, this is built on generations. It's really, really common to have Indian soldiers, whose parents and grandparents had been soldiers in the Edwardian Army. They've been in the First World War, Victorian Army, and so on, and the Victorian Indian Army, and so on. And so there's this corporate identity to be really, really good in these units that has been built up over time. Okay, it's not invented in the Second World War. It's just that the Second World War is able to take advantage of that. When it expands, it doesn't lose that identity. The Indian Army really keeps its identity very, very well in a way that, say, the British Army doesn't. The British Army goes from being a small professional army into a citizens conscript army and so on, whereas the Indian Army is always volunteer and it remains very professional in its attitude, and that is particularly seen in its officers as well. At the beginning of the war, there is that classic hiring and firing of the dross, but an awful lot of that dross are British Army officers that are sent over there, rather than Indian officers, and the Indian officers do well. People like, I mentioned Rees just now, but Slim, David Punch Cowan. Punch Cowan gets the job of commanding 17th Indian Division in 1942 because the British Army officer, who comes in as his boss when he's a brigadier, cocks it all up in 1942. He destroys a bridge with 2/3 of his division on the wrong side of it. And they all have to lose all their equipment and swim the river, and he gets rightly fired for it. Noel Irwin, I mentioned him earlier. He's the one that's sending in infantry against Japanese bunkers, like it's like a 1915, like the Battle of Loos. And they don't have the sort of, they haven't gone through the learning curve yet to work out how you attack them. And bear in mind, he was in the bloody learning curve, Noel Irwin. He fought in the First World War. He should know better. But he sends them in. He's a British Army officer, so he's gone as well. The Indian Army officers, generally speaking, are the better officers in the Burma camp. And generally speaking, they really are. And it's this corporate identity of we are still a professional army. We may be being massively expanded, but we are definitely still a professional army. And it's only really the beginning of the war where that doesn't work very well. At the beginning of the war against Japan, because they rush recruits too soon into battle in 1942, and that's a big problem there. But no, that point that I was making earlier is the fact that because India today is it's partitioned. B, obviously we were the colonial power there, and there is obviously a reason why they don't necessarily want to look at the Indian army. Not that every Indian person does. There are lots of Indians that are very interested in this, but I'm talking at quite an official level. That the INA is the official sort of part of the story of modern India and so on, and despite the myths that are behind that. And so it falls on us as British people, I think, to be the ones that carry this story on. And that's a really, really important thing to me. And, I make an author's note at the beginning of the book. It's really, really hard to find soldiers' stories themselves. It's getting easier, and I'm getting easier because more people approach me now as I'm doing further books. But a big part of what I try to do is, and again, if you're a general reader, you might find this a little bit tedious. And I apologise to a degree, but I also don't apologise in another respect, in that I want to include the stories of lots and lots of different people, even if it's really, really small, tiny things that in the grand scheme of things aren't that important. But say the officer chose to include, the British adjutant said that so-and-so soldier, so in Thunder on an example where it names a particular Gurkha soldier because he goes out and rescues wounded under fire. And there's nothing else about it. And that's not winning battles, but he's doing something for his friends. And I chose to include it. And one of the things that a lot of people liked, I did a similar thing in Forgotten Arm, was lots of people talked about the fact that they like the fact that they like one really stuck in my mind. I described the death of a particular crew, 3 or 4 of them, as they're evacuating a Grant tank in the Battle of Imphal in Forgotten Armour. And a relative got in touch and said, we had no idea how he died. We just know he died that day, one of the people I named. And it really meant something to them as a family that, they went out their way to contact me and say, look, we didn't know, we'd not been to the archives and dug through, because that wasn't in the war diary. That was in a after action report at the brigade level. And a lot of families don't think to look there. They look at the war diary because, well, that's the closest thing to what their relative did. But he's not named there. He's named in the brigade after action report. And so I included his story and what happened to him. And that person, it was really, really touching to know how much it meant to him. He'd told his mum about it, so obviously that person's, really, really wonderful. And so I've continued that. I won't shy away from naming it, even if it's a bit, random. There's another one that I talk about, a guy, I literally was writing this yesterday, in 1942, when the John Randall's battalion, the 7th 10th Baluch, he gets... he sees a guy who's fighting Japanese off almost at point blank with a Tommy gun, and he's last seen swinging it as a club, and he's never seen again. But he's named, so I've named him. He doesn't do anything more than that. It's amazing. And obviously his death at some point in the minutes after that probably, is an amazing piece of bravery. Bearing in mind, this unit was newly raised. He'd never seen these soldiers had never seen combat before. And he's there fighting to the death like that, swinging. He's run out of ammunition. He's using his Tommy gun as a club. Another. I name another guy. Actually, I'm so tangential. Sorry, I'm always like this. But another guy's last seen strangling a Japanese soldier, in hand-to-hand fighting. Never seen again afterwards, as the battalion is overrun and things like that. But again, these stories are there if you look. It's just difficult to find their own voices, and that's what I'm always really sad about. But I'm hoping as I get a bit more well-known and things like that, that I'll be in the position to go to India myself and try and find these stories more directly, rather than relying on what's available here and in the National Archives and the Imperial War Museum and all those sorts of things. Some of these stories do come up, don't get me wrong, that some of them exist, but they're just much harder to find. And when I find them, I use them generally. But, I do my best is what I'm saying.
See, I like all the little side stories. I really like it. There's loads of them in your books, because I've got Forgotten Armor as well, and I've read that, and that's awesome. And there's lots of them in your books. There's a story in James Holland wrote about Burma, and there's a story about a guy jumping out of the trench under fire and going back to his camp to get the tea because he forgot the tea.
Yeah,
and
again, they're not important in the grand scheme of things.
No, but
they tell you something.
Yeah.
about
definitely.
the sort of the human spirit and things like that
Yeah.
in incredible and awful experiences. Because like, I get very very animated, and like, I'm like this at school with kids and things like that as well. I find these stories amazing and fascinating, but I have to sometimes remind myself they're also horrific. An awful lot of
Yeah.
them, they are horrific, but amazing at the same time. I find myself weirdly sort of a tension inside myself because I find these stories so fascinating, and I worry that I don't want to over egg them as these great brave. I don't want it to feel like too much like a commando comic, because all of these things I write about are true, but
Yeah.
like I just worry that I go over the top.
No, well, both your books are awesome, so you didn't. What was the touch and go moment that this whole operation nearly failed?
Yeah, so the big thing is really that stuff over the airfield. So one of the big things that happens is the Japanese bring in a new commander to take over, because this is another one of the things I really quite strongly criticise Kimura for this. Another one of the two big mistakes he makes when he sends the 18th Division and the 49th Division to attack Meiktila. What he does is, or what he doesn't do, I should say, he doesn't give one of the two commanders operational control. And he should do. And to be honest, there's a really obvious answer. The 18th Division is experienced. It may be under strength in terms of its manpower, but he gives all of 15th Army's large artillery. So in First World War terms, they'd call it siege artillery. So they're 150 millimeter howitzers, 105 millimeter howitzers, loads more anti-tank guns. And obviously these two divisions have their own organic artillery as well. So basically he tools them up. The 18th Division this is. Whereas the 49th Division are completely green. They are under strength as well, but not quite as under strength and manpower. But they don't have any of these additions. It just makes complete sense that really the commander of the 18th Division, he should be in charge. But he doesn't. And it is a huge error, because what happens is that the two divisions, 49th and 18th, fight two separate battles from the opposite sides. They don't really properly coordinate. It's only halfway through the battle that a guy called Masaki Honda arrives. So he comes down from fighting 31st Army, who are fighting the Americans in the north. He comes down and basically takes over the operation. So finally, they do have a proper commander, like effectively a corps commander. And Kimura's missed out that level of leadership to his regret, basically, sort of using hindsight. And Honda is the one that makes the decision. We just have to hit the airfield. That's like every day, Dakotas are coming in all through the day. Got to hit the airfield. So what they start doing is from both ends of it, because Honda's now coordinating the two sides, and those big armored sweeps that I talked about and the attacks all around, they're still happening. But there is more attention on the airfield than there ever have been. So the other stuff's still going on, but the airfield becomes the focus. And what they do is they infiltrate the airfield every single night, the famous jitter raids and things like that. Sometimes as much as an entire battalion of Japanese infantry get onto the airfield, and they just dig in somewhere along it. They plant mines on the runway. They don't quite have the time, and they're worried about noise as well, to say dig just a trench directly across the runway, almost like an anti-tank obstacle. So if something lands, it would its undercarriage would collapse and flip it over. They don't quite have the ability to do that, although that's something they should have done if they could. What happens is that they then get on there, and so every morning the RAF regiment. Now, it should be said, the RAF regiment are another unit actually that have not forgotten this battle. They are very keen on this as well. They have this as like one of their modern battle honours and things like that. The RAF regiment are flown in as part of the reinforcements to do their job of looking after the airfield. The problem is really they're not designed for sort of medium-term, higher intensity kinetic operations. They're designed as units that can do those things in short bursts, a couple of days here and there, that sort of thing. But going for weeks, having to fight these, an entire battalion, and they're not the size of a battalion, they're smaller than that. And also they're smaller than an infantry battalion anyway. But they're having to go on these patrols, and what often is happening is some of them they clear fine, but on some of the days, when they're fighting entire Japanese battalions, they have to call on for reinforcements. So there's a box next to the air for one of these defensive boxes right next to the airfield. And so they're coming out and then joining them. So like a squadron of tanks will come out and join them. as they do their sweep, or they'll be called up, because obviously if they're being used to clear the airfield, they're not fighting the Japanese somewhere else. Now, there are only so many assets within the sort of the garrison at Meiktila, but it works very well. And there are some amazing stories. And again, I won't spoil it too much, but there are some really, really bitter battles across that airfield. And obviously, sometimes the aircraft are landing under fire as well. And there are some amazing and incredible bravery as well in trying to sort out stricken aircraft and get wounded off them as they're trying to take off with wounded soldiers. Because the important thing is supplies come in, but wounded come out. Is the key thing that happens. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's all about the airfield in that sort of last 2 weeks of the month, and this sort of really quite bitter fight between Cowan and Honda over control of it, because Cowan knows if we lose this, we lose Meiktila. So we need to win on the airfield. And so that really becomes, whilst everything else going on, it becomes the airfield as the centre.
Well, when they finally reach their objective, what does victory look like, success look like on the ground?
So, well, that's the interesting thing, because it basically is where, when they send out an armoured sweep and they find the Japanese have pulled out in every direction. Okay, so they send a number of different patrols out and the Japanese are gone. That's the main thing. But it's interesting because one or two places they do have small rearguard fights for, particularly directly east towards a place called Tazi, which is where Honda's HQ had been, about 20 miles to the east. There's some fighting there, for example. Mm-hmm. But basically, it's the realization that the ring has suddenly disappeared. Okay, a couple of patrols have met troops from the Mandalay front as well. And then finally, sort of just on like the 28th of March, they get a first proper column of vehicles come through, and they've properly joined hand with Mandalay. And what's basically happened is, they've crushed it's now Honda's troops from the north, and Meiktila at the bottom, they've spurt eastwards. If you think you're sort of squeezing something and it all comes out one end, like a toothpaste tube, if you hammer a toothpaste tube, it all things out one end. That's basically what happens here. They go east and then south, and they get chased into the Sitang River Valley. So really, the victory looks like the moment where suddenly the intensity drops off, literally overnight. Different units will record the battle ending. Often the 28th of March is seen as the end of the battle. I actually argue it's the 31st, because that's when they get to Tazi and sort of capture that. So I would say it's slightly later. And also it's just neat for describing it as well, that the battle takes place for the whole of March. But realistically, it's when you get to Tazi and they realise they've got to an evacuated HQ, for example, burnt papers and things like that are around and that sort of thing. And they're basically just now, they're on a... so I sometimes say that Meiktila is really the last big set-piece battle that both sides are taking part in, because obviously, the amphibious operation that captures Rangoon, that's a big set-piece, but it's not a battle because the Japanese have already pulled out. And other battles, places like Purebuoy, sometimes Purebuoy is described as the last big set piece, and that's the one that George MacDonald Fraser he fights there and writes quite a lot about that. That sometimes seems it, but the difference with Purebuoy, the reason why I don't say it's a big set piece is the Japanese, a particular part of the Japanese 18th Division have just dug in there, whilst everyone else is getting away, and it's like a rear guard, and really just it's not quite a stop, plan, go. It's just you hook round, you take the tanks and hook round behind them, you take some more tanks and hook round there, and we'll just crush them. And it's all just sort of on the fly, back of a fag packet the evening before when they've come across it. And then when they get to the fight, really it's a series of small last stands around a town rather than one continuous battle with a central commander. Really, it's just a couple of units, a couple of battalions have dug in, and they're just wiped out. Over 1,000 Japanese are killed in Purebuoy, but it's kind of just a bit of a severe mopping up operation rather than a big set piece battle. And it's just like a speed bump on the way to Rangoon. That's the other sort of reason for it as well. It lasts a day and a half, and they're on the road to Rangoon straight afterwards. Again, racing the monsoon. That's the big thing they're trying to beat.
And with all that, and with the success of the mission, the operation, why is this not known, this campaign not known, like Battle of the Bulge, for instance?
Yeah, the big reason, I think, is realistically because it takes place in March and April and May of 1945. So there's big news in Europe to follow, rather than following what's going on in the Far East. People are much more interested in the end of the European War, and completely rightly. I don't have a problem with that. I think it's absolutely fair enough. Germany, the great threat in Europe, has been defeated. The crossing of the Rhine is in the middle of this battle, that sort of thing. It's completely understandable that this battle has been pushed to the side. Then you've got all those other things we said earlier about, most soldiers. If we're going to say that tanks are forgotten because most British soldiers are writing home about being an infantryman, the corollary of that is also the fact that most British families have soldiers fighting Germany, not fighting Japan. And so most people get that the family story is what happened in the war against Germany. And it's the very dedicated people of things like the Burma Star Memorial Fund that continue their families' stories. But though, that leans into it. All of that is because there are just so many more people that are interested in that fight because it's directly impacting their family in a way that Burma is not. And that's fair enough. I don't really find that a particularly difficult thing to talk about. I'm not bitter about it. Like, some people are. Although I did see a really funny meme the other day of that one of the one of the skeleton underwater, and then there's a child drowning, and then there's a favourite child being held up. And it's like you've got the war in Europe, you've got the war in Italy, and the Eighth Army being bitter about D-Day dodges, and there's Burma is basically just completely out of the picture. It's not even involved. But yeah, it's just all of those things together, basically. But this is why it's why I wrote the book, why I loved reading about it in Forgotten Armour, because it should be said, I didn't really know about this battle, and obviously some people did. For me, 3 years ago, the conquest of Burma, the liberation of Burma, was just mopping up. They'd been beaten at Imphal and Kohima. There were some clever sort of deception maneuvers, and then the Japanese were defeated and routed, and they pulled out to Thailand, just as Germany surrenders. And basically the war is over in Burma at roughly the same time the war in Europe is over. The rest of the fighting is further east in the Pacific Campaign and that sort of thing. And then the atomic bombs. So all of this is pushed aside because I suppose the atomic bombings also then overshadow the end of the war in Burma because the whole of Japan has surrendered, and that becomes the story as well. Because just another reason for it. And that was really my view of 1945 in Burma 3 years ago before I really started to take the idea of writing about this seriously. And so therefore, at the end of the day, it's just been pushed aside, and I want to push it back to the front of the queue because it's such an interesting operation on so many levels, and also the fact there are even this is how NATO intended to fight the Soviets. It is really what Thunder Run represents. In particular, if they were pushed back and then got into a position to counterattack, it would have been stuff like this. It's just that instead of Dakotas, it would have been things like helicopters.
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
And what do you hope people take away from reading your book?
The big thing I hope is that people take that actually the 14th Army is one of the most modern outfits that was ever put into battle in the Second World War. This is a big maneuver warfare battle to engineer an enemy out into a particular position so you can destroy him decisively to then make what could have been very difficult very, very easy. Classic maneuverist thinking. Sun Tzu and Clausewitz would be proud of it. Napoleon would love it. Okay, just that Napoleon would probably be a bit more head on with it, perhaps. But it's one of these things that is an absolute classic in the art of warfare, but it is thoroughly modern in its execution. That mixture of air power, mechanized infantry, armored maneuver, air power in terms of both, ground attack and also the supply logistics and so on. It has everything apart from, amphibious stuff. And even then that creeps in at the end with Operation Dracula capturing Rangoon, which isn't really part of this story, but you feel obliged to mention that it happens. Because the Thunder Run pulls up short about 50 miles when the monsoon starts. And interesting, I mentioned this in the book, 17th Indian Division, who are obviously on the Thunder Run, and instead of being rested, they're in place, so they may as well crack on to Rangoon. And MacDonald Fraser, he's very moving on this as well, but other people are as well. Cowan's chief of staff talks about this as well, seeing this. Because the 17th Indian Division had been the first to fight in 1942 in Burma, they kind of felt like getting back to Rangoon was their operation. And they genuinely, MacDonald Fraser puts it something along the line of, soldiers have a primitive sense of fairness, and they felt that this was unfair. Rangoon was theirs, that kind of thing, he says. And this guy Pettigrew, the chief of staff to Cowan, he says something similar. A lot of this men, especially the old sweats, who were there in 1942, they're really, really bitter that they weren't allowed to march into Rangoon. Because it'd been emptied, so why not just let them march? There's no one there. Let them march in. It's 50 miles. They could have done it. But they were exhausted, and I think Slim just wants to get it over and done with. Open up the port, He doesn't want to find the Japanese blocking positions between them or something that they don't know about. But yeah.
And finally, well, my final question is usually what's next for yourself? But you are writing a new book, and you're
Yeah.
halfway through it, quarter of the way through it.
About quarter of the way through it, yeah. So I'm
Way.
doing a 1942 book, which because of this thing, you can see I'm slightly the mindset because I've brought in a couple of 1942 examples to things, but but this thing, I'm going to sort of semi-officially call it because the 17th Indian Division are obviously in the Thunder Run. They're a big part of Forgotten Armour as well, because in Forgotten Armour I cover both tanks in 1942. And obviously, I cover Imphal as well, where 17th Indian Division is at all of those. So I'm calling them the Black Cat trilogy because they are the Black Cat division. I've got here, actually, this is my original. This is the shoulder badge for the 17th Indian Division. It's a Second World War original. But it's my Black Cat trilogy is what I'm sort of semi-officially calling it. But the nice thing is that this one's with Osprey. So they've sort of taken me on, which is wonderful. I actually also I've also written them one of the, their short books, their little thin ones, New Vanguard.
Yeah.
These are both out in 2027. But I've done one about sort of tank warfare, like one of their short books as well. I've done a tanks in Burma type one of their New Vanguard series. But again, they're not out to 2027. So yeah, the big thing with the big 1942 book though is, so it's 120,000 words. So it's a bit longer than these two. These are 100,000 words each. But it's a big sweep of the whole thing, and I'm doing I'm doing the ground war, obviously, and so tanks will come into that. But I'm telling the wider ground war, including the Chinese, because a big thing that's often forgotten about is how important the Chinese are in this. But also the air power thing. I've done quite a lot on the air power, the Flying Tigers, who again, your American, your 30% American listeners will absolutely love the fact that I go into the Flying Tigers a lot. Honestly, you're gonna have to allow me another direction. I've got some patches. These are reproductions; they're not originals. But I've got the Flying Tigers patch. I love all this kind of stuff. But we've got to talk about America. You're naming, okay? Because the first squadron of the AVG, okay, the Adam and Eves, okay, the first pursuit, there she is, nude, chasing him in the Garden of Eden, the Genesis of the AVG. Fair enough, great name, works. Genesis, Adam and Eves. The third squadron, AVG, the Hells Angels. Great, aggressive, makes you think of bikers, love a nudie on one of these as well. But what were you thinking with the panda bears? It's too cuddly. Okay, I love the Flying Tigers. Honestly, they're amazing. They're such a great bunch of pirates and and all this, and cowboys and all this sort of thing. They're walking around in check shirts and cowboy boots and Colt 45s and cartridge belts. But I couldn't in all seriousness be a panda bear. But they're in it, is my point. And also just to return to a bit more serious, the horrific civilian situation as well. And I've got some amazing eyewitnesses on that. An Anglo-Burmese 11-year-old who goes out with his family, treks through the Hawkong Valley. So it's some really, really quite awful things in it as well. So I haven't quite got to that bit, but I imagine that I'll get that feeling that historians of the Holocaust get. I mean, obviously not quite as the same thing and not quite as bad, but still horrendous, and happened to women and children and old people, and I have a lot of fun talking about the AVG, because they're brilliant. But this will be a roller coaster of a book, frankly. My big thing is the fact we forget that it's a fighting retreat. We too often think about the 1942 as being, it's an embarrassing withdrawal. Don't get me wrong, it is embarrassing, but the spirit of the men, as low as they get in morale terms, they fight really, really, really hard in awful circumstances that are not of their own making. There are much bigger structural problems. I'm very critical of a number of people. John Smith, who blows up that bridge that cuts half the 17th Indian Division. I am brutal with him. To be honest, he deserves it, and a few others as well. But yeah, I'm very excited about that, as you can tell, to get that one out there. And I do the podcast with Rob Lyman as well, the Forgotten War podcast. So that's the other big thing. So we're just wrapping up 1942, and we're getting into 1943. So the Chindits will be around shortly on that.
Well, I'll be talking to Rob soon as well.
Yeah. So he's a wonderful man. So
yeah, awesome. So Jack. This is your book, Thunder Run, excellent book, and I've really enjoyed talking to you today. Didn't know what to say sometimes when you'd finished because I was so invested in what you were saying.
Oh, so I know I'm such a waffler.
No, it's like it was just so fascinating, and this is such an interesting book, and I look forward to what you produce next.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, thanks again for having me on as well. As you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. I love sharing it. So thanks so much for taking me on.
More than welcome. More than welcome. You take care now, and I'll put a link down below for both your books, actually. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you everyone, guys, for watching.
Bye bye now.
Bye.